Thank you very much, everybody who takes interest into what's happening now in the eastern part of our continent. The most important topic on the order of the day when it comes to international affairs is the situation at the border between Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. And our podcast is dedicated to this topic. Happy to have with us, apart from Professors Diaconescu and maybe later on Professors Goshu and Karp, who are my distinguished colleagues from the Center for Russian Studies, happy to have with us today the senior professor Armando Marques Guedes from the University of Lisbon, one of the most renowned professors in international affairs in our continent. Happy to have with us Sebastian Schäffer, again from the Institut for the Donauraum, Mitteleuropa in Vienna, my distinguished colleague there, and his second presence already with us. Dan Perry, who's a former Associated Press chief editor in Europe, for Europe, and one of distinguished editorialists in different personifications. Again, the second time joining us, Professor Andreas Umland, whose CV is so thick, I cannot say too much, but apart from his doctorate in Cambridge, thank you for understanding me, Andreas, when mentioning this. He's from, he had fellowships with the Shevchenko University in Kiev, the Ukrainian Institute for the Future in Kiev, Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, the Institute of International Relations in Prague, and since 2020, he's analyst at the Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. One of the most important editors of books, of series of books, and very senior academic journals as well. And I only mention this, the Journal of Soviet and Post-Soviet Politics and Society, as well as the Ideology and Politics Journal. Thank you, Andreas, for joining us. With us is also Misha Kemper, who will be in the background listening to our discussion. I'm happy to welcome Professor Armando Goshu from the Faculty of Political Sciences, and as I said, our fellow professor at the Center of Russian Studies in Bucharest. Unfortunately, the virus has brought us changes in the format of this podcast. Both with regret, both Dan Perry and Misha Kemper have had encountering the virus recently, and I hope nothing will. The virus will not deliver them any bad news. Hopefully, since we all bet on Omicron's level of infectiosity. Joining with us are younger fellows of the Center for Russian Studies in Bucharest. You can see their names, as well as our PR and technical team, Mrs. Carmen Bendowski in Vienna and Mr. Andrei Oprea in Bucharest. I will end my brief introduction here, and I will then ask Dan to kick off the discussion. I think 15 minutes to everybody of us in this order: Dan Perry, Professor Goshu, Andreas Umland, and Armando Guedes, or the reverse, would fill the first hour, since not all of us participating today do have time for more than 1 hour of discussion, of participating with the discussion. So then, what is the landscape about? What can be done there? What marvels could politicians in Europe and over the ocean perform?
Oh my lord! I mean, I don't know about marvels. This is a brass tacks situation that calls for real politic, I guess, and maybe a bit of brinksmanship. But look, my perspective, I think, is different from some of the others on this call. Is sort of journalistic and sort of an ordinary person's perspective. I also have to say that I was based in Bucharest, and as such, also covering the collapse of communism around, well, in the Soviet bloc as a whole, and in the Soviet Union particularly, when Ukraine became independent in 1991. I remember it. I remember being in the streets of Chernovtsi and Lvov, now Lviv, and people dancing in the streets and talking about the end of history. And it's kind of comical looking back. History had other plans, but I believed it at the time as a very young person. Look, on a broad question of the landscape, I see a number of issues. The first is the right of a country to claim a zone of influence, what Russia calls the near abroad. This is a right that, you know, some countries demand at different levels, you know, Serbia and Yugoslavia and the US and the Americas. Sometimes it is understood and accepted if the demander is powerful enough economically or strategically, but it often leads to trouble, obviously. The US has been allowed it in the Americas, and obviously Russia has been in the past. That is essentially what the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact were. Russia has stayed quiet on this issue for about 30 years since the collapse of communism, of the Soviet Union at least. I mean, not totally quiet, obviously, and less so in the past decade. But the idea now being tested rather overtly by Putin is that Russia has the right to demand it. And if it were recognized that it had that right, then perhaps we could all be made to understand from Russia's perspective that Ukraine being in NATO is about as ridiculous as California, if it seceded, being in the Warsaw Pact. So some people would deny Russia that right. But Russians, not just Putin, but many other Russians still would like it. So on one level, it's a yes-no question. But perhaps there is a middle point where the zone of interest is not formal. And the West were more cautious about things like NATO membership, which brings us to the second issue being tested, which is NATO. I'm not so sure that NATO nations fully thought out their offer in principle to Ukraine of membership, which actually first happened at the Bucharest summit in 2008. When I was the Europe editor for the Associated Press, I remember we covered it. And I was just amazed. I'm not sure the people of the 30-odd countries of NATO are prepared to go to war with Russia under Article 5 of NATO, which says an attack on one is an attack on all. Are Belgians prepared to fight to preserve the sanctity of Ukraine's borders? And this is an issue that I think we need to focus on as part of the world order. Borders are important because their inviolability is something of a principle in the post-World War II order. And yet, of course, a lot of the post-colonial borders in Africa and elsewhere are nonsensical. And that clearly applies also for the former internal borders of the Soviet Union, which now suddenly became international borders. Remember that these internal Soviet borders were designed oftentimes in such a way as to mix populations and cause trouble. Romanians should know this very well, considering basically the insidious incorporation of Transnistria into Moldova, precisely to dilute its Romanianness and complicate the picture. Something similar happened with Ukraine and Russia. The idea that NATO needs to constantly expand is also a little bit problematic when the obligations of NATO are as profound as they are. I mean, if NATO is basically now meant to contain Russia, on the other hand, as it was meant to contain USSR, then we can also not be surprised when Russia reacts. I mean, Putin's a bad faith player for sure, but we've given him a very good excuse, we as in the West. The third issue here is more broad, almost philosophical. Who has the right to be a nation? I mean, self-determination is a wonderful principle of the same post-World War II order that I just mentioned before. But realpolitik and geostrategy often, and maybe even usually, get in the way and ultimately prevail. So sure, Ukraine is a nation different from Russia, probably about the same as Portugal is a nation different from Spain. And yet, not every group of people that feels they're a nation, or even every group of people that convincingly projects they're a nation, has a nation state. The Kurds don't, the Catalans don't, the Uyghurs don't, and Russia itself has been allowed to trample nations like the Chechens. I mean, it's clear the Chechens are different from the Russians, but nobody cares. So it comes down to whether the claimant nation and denier nation or nations can exercise, which side can exercise more power, whether militarily or diplomatically or economically or by mobilizing enough world support. On the issue of Ukraine, I think, in this sort of jungle that we have, they've won their right to be a nation. But there is a real question about the viability of the borders and whether outsiders are going to help them fight for the, making permanent of the Soviet borders. And in fact, we saw that in an embarrassing and pretty clear way when the Obama regime and the entire world basically acquiesced to the takeover of Crimea. I mean, which looked pretty pitiful. Imagine if Ukraine had been a member of NATO at that point. I mean, maybe you could argue it would not have been invaded, but you could also argue World War III would have begun. So that's a landscape. I think your other question is what can be done? Well, I mean, there are two scenarios here. One is if we believe Russia can be taken at its word as to what it wants and placated in ways that one could placate a rational player and a good faith actor. But the other scenario is that Russia is a bad faith actor that basically just wants to stir up trouble no matter what. For reasons like Putin is pretty close to a dictator and they need to divert attention to outside crises. This is from the playbook. And no matter what you do, they're not going to be satisfied. There's no way to predict which is the case here because too much depends on one particular person. I mean, Russia is basically run by the post-KGB, but really it depends on Putin and a person who clearly enjoys being unpredictable and dangerous. I mean, I lived in Cairo for most of the past decade, and there's a lot of respect for Putin there as being a strong man and disdain for democratic countries for not knowing how to stand up to him. And this applies all over the Arab world and all over much of the rest of the world. Putin has gained authority on a global scale by being so unpredictable. So if we're to try to take a statement seriously and look at what can be done, then as I said before, the central issue on the table appears to be NATO membership for Ukraine. Russia under Yeltsin put up with the expansion of NATO all across the former Soviet zone of influence, Warsaw Pact countries basically, including Romania. Russia under Putin seems unwilling to tolerate this going any further, especially to the former Soviet Socialist Republic of Ukraine. I suspect a face-saving way out is needed, but I say this with some humility and almost temerity, because I'm kind of predicting what Putin will do, and that's a fool's errand. I suspect that if we do a face-saving thing, a reasonable way forward would involve replacing the carrot of NATO membership for Ukraine with EU membership. I mean, that'll upset Russia as well, but it replaces defense and strategic issues with prosperity concerns and values issues. And it would be more difficult for Putin to use it as a pretext. I suspect the people of Russia also want to be members of the European Union. But it's also true that, even an elegant come down on NATO would be seen by some as an appeasement of a dictator, and that could whet his appetite. There is no doubt that it would be a terrible outcome for Putin to emerge victorious in some clear way, beyond the Ukraine issue, in some global philosophical way. It would be bad for the Russian people for Putin to emerge stronger. So we're in a real pickle here. And I think even beyond NATO, unless Russia changes course, we're probably headed towards a greater degree of economic conflict with Russia, because Europe is so hobbled by its dependence on Russian natural gas, not just, but mostly. It would have to come to the US to lead a major sanctions regime and a political isolation regime against the Russian leadership. That would really hurt if the result of all this is adventurism in Ukraine. And that, of course, leads to a different issue, which is that we're faced by this terrible internal weakness in the United States. And that I think is the greatest global crisis actually looming around the corner. I mean, we have a president that, you saw numbers coming out today on inflation. We have a president who is heavily distracted by economic difficulties at home. We have the possibility of a truly authoritarian pivot if the Republicans should return to power. And overall in the US, we have internal divisions so profound and so destabilizing potentially as to make the Ukraine crisis seem trifling by comparison.
Thank you very much, Dan. Interesting. But just one brief question. What was the reason Moscow edited that list of demands addressed to NATO member countries and to Washington in particular? It was a bit off the line.
Yeah, I know. Look, I mean, I think it's a negotiating tactic. You sometimes, you present a lot of demands meant to confuse. You want one thing. It's bigger than what they want to give you. So you ask for that one thing and a million other things, and people get freaked out, and they might give you the one thing because it'll look like a victory. The other Russian demands are so ridiculous and unlikely that if they're serious about those demands, then it's hard to even say the words, but it almost could lead to war. Mm-hmm. So I see little evidence that they're being taken seriously, which is why in my own comments, I focused on NATO membership for Ukraine. That gave Russia a tool that I think you should never give a dictator, which is it gave them the opportunity to make reasonable demands. From the Russian perspective, to reject NATO membership from Ukraine is reasonable. And, if you give a guy like Putin a reasonable pretext, he will take the other demands. I can hardly imagine much serious discussion about them.
Thank you very much, Dan. I'll come back to you when, if you still have time to stay with us. And I now ask Professor Goshu to make his own introduction presentation, maybe.
Thank you, Mihai. Ukraine in NATO, it's a pretext for Putin, who has said he wants a new post-Cold War international order. Nobody now prepared to give a membership to Ukraine. I'm sure that Andreas will respond to Dan Perry. I refer to something else in my speech. I want to refer to President Macron's visit to Moscow, to today's Normandy format, meeting format in Berlin. And I think this issue remains valid for the next week's visit of Chancellor Scholz to Moscow. I imagine that every European leader has low expectation after Spanish Borrell's visit to Moscow last year. I don't think you have forgotten how Lavrov behaved with EU High Representative in Moscow. 2 days ago, Emmanuel Macron went to Moscow in his capacity as President of France, which is in the Normandy format. Macron went to Moscow not as the leader of the country holding the presidency of European Council. I assume that he coordinated with maybe Germany or with the High Representative, but not more. It's a question of competences here. The nearly 6 hours discussion in Moscow between Macron and Putin focused on the Minsk agreements. Russia is trying to mobilize the West to put pressure on Ukraine to implement the Minsk agreements. Putin is demanding strict, literal compliance, which is impossible. 7 years have passed since the agreements were concluded. The situation on the ground is different now. In order to unblock 5-6 years ago the implementation of the agreements, the current president of Germany, Steinmeier, when he was foreign minister, proposed the famous Steinmeier formula. It means concrete steps to follow. There has also been talk about a roadmap to determine the implementation of the agreements. In fact, immediately after the signing, it became clear that the agreements could not be implemented because each side interpreted them differently. Russia demanded that Ukraine immediately adopt legislation to transform the separatist entities into state actors by federalizing the country and hold the regional election. Ukraine demanded the implementation of security measures, first and foremost the withdrawal of weapons, mercenaries, taking control of the border with Russia. After 7 years and after Putin gave more than 600,000 passports, Russian passports, to the inhabitants of Donbass, after the separatist region are economically integrated into Russia, it is impossible to revive long dead documents. They are dead not because Ukraine killed them. No, it is Russia that is blocking the implementation of the Minsk agreements. And it is a very important question here. Why does Putin insist on the Minsk agreement? Putin sees the Minsk agreements as a trap for Ukraine, to keep Ukraine prisoner in the Russian zone of influence. He insists on the federalization of Ukraine, on a negotiation mechanism between Kiev and, on the one hand, and Donetsk and Lugansk on the other, for all important decisions, especially foreign policy, security, and defense policy. This means that a large country, France, of over 600,000 square kilometers, would be a prisoner of a pro-Russian separatist entities piloted by Moscow secret services, organized into People's Republic, each controlling a territory of 8,000 kilometers, square kilometers. This would be Putin's ideal scenario. The implementation of the Minsk agreements, as Russia interprets them. With these agreements, Putin hopes to hold an entire country, Ukraine, captive in Ruski Mir, which is Putin's major objective in this crisis in relation to Ukraine. To seize Donbass, to annex Donbass, to gain land passage from Russia to Crimea? I don't think. Putin wants all of Ukraine in a Russia zone of influence. How can he do that? 3 ways. Through the Minsk agreements. It means federalization of Ukraine with the granting of veto power to separatist region that will have a major influence on any decision in Kiev. This way, using Donetsk and Lugansk, Russia will control the entire country, Ukraine. The second scenario, by piloting an insurgency, a rebellion, to bring a pro-Russian government to power in Kiev, which could lead to the civil war. And the third, by a large military offensive leading to the military occupation of the whole country, which could lead to partisan warfare and make the Soviet campaign in Afghanistan look like, a success story. Perhaps we should realize that by insisting on the Minsk agreements, we run the risk of playing into the hands of Putin and condemning Ukraine to remaining Russia's prisoner on the long term. Thank you for your attention. Unfortunately, I can't stay very much. I have a conference with Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. Sorry.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Armand, for your presentation. I'm jealous when it comes to different conference that you have to attend. So you maybe you can still be with us.
I'll stay for more 30 minutes here.
Okay. I'm around the table. One question maybe for Armand, if any. We still have time for the next two guests of ours. Then I will jump in and ask Armand, who is Moscow ready to dupe? Is Berlin or Paris in the end when it comes to the Minsk agreement?
It's very hard to answer. I don't have information, clear information, but my perception is that the France try to play a bigger role and to give more, for more visibility for the President Macron. And I don't think France has capacity of has analyzed experts and has capacity of analyzing the situation in Ukraine. The answer is France.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Armand. I will now ask Andreas to deliver us his perspective onto the role Crimea plays between Russia, Ukraine, and the rest of the world. And we will see then if the elephant in the room has been seen by yourself as well. Thank you, Andreas.
Thank you, Mihai, for the invitation. I'm honored and excited to speak here. This is a very nice initiative. I like this idea of a Center of Russian Studies in Bucharest. I've been in Bucharest already, participated there at a Bucharest security conference. And I'm also very grateful to Armand Gosu for his presentation. I would have basically said the same if I would have to speak on this. And maybe I'll say a few more words at the end. Mihai has also asked us to comment maybe on the question of Ukrainian identity and the relationship between Russia and Ukraine. And usually the example that I use here is for the German public is the comparison of the relationship between Russia and Ukraine with that between Germany and the Netherlands. So the Germans and the Dutch are culturally close. They've been once together in the so-called old empire, the Holy German Empire of the German nation. The Dutch language is sometimes called sort of lower German. Roman times, the currently Dutch territory was called Germania Inferior. And when the Dutch come to Germany, they understand German. Many of them speak German. But on the reverse, when we Germans go to the Netherlands, we understand some of the Dutch language, but usually, or many of us don't speak Dutch. And so this is all very much reminiscent of the Ukrainian-Russian relationship. The other issue here is that sometimes it's brought up that Ukraine is allegedly divided. Again, that's to a certain degree true, but that is not something unusual. We have that in Germany as well. You know, the Protestant North, the Catholic South, and many other countries have, Belgium is divided, Spain is divided, Great Britain is divided, and so this sort of regional division is also not something unusual. And what basically Putin has succeeded is impressing on large parts of the Western public that there's something special about Ukraine, that it's a sort of unnatural state, or that it's not really a nation. But if you look on it from a comparative perspective, there are actually many situations like that around the world, and perhaps Armando will also add to that. But now I come to Crimea, which is, I guess, the most contested issue. And here too, I think much of the Western discourse about Crimea has been successfully impregnated with stereotypes that were already spread in Tsarist Russia, later in Soviet Russia, now in post-Soviet Russia, that allegedly Crimea is something genuinely and originally Russian. And if you look at the history of it, there is, of course, a connection here with the Tsarist Empire and then with the Soviet Empire, and there are also demographic arguments to be made, and sometimes there is a certain cherry picking with which not only Russian propagandists but also Western commentators, they pick out certain more or less true facts from Crimea's history and then try to argue that somehow this is a Russian territory. But if you look at the actual history, then it's much more debatable. I'm usually trying to illustrate that to Western observers with the simple fact that there's still people today in Ukraine living who are remembering a Crimea in which the ethnic Russians were not yet a majority of the population. So until 1944, ethnic Russians were only around 50 or less than 50% of the Crimean population. And these older people today that would still remember the early 1940s or the late 1930s, they would have had grandparents in turn who would have remembered a time until around 1900 when the ethnic Russians were not yet even the largest ethnic group on Crimea. Only around 1900, the ethnic Russians became the relatively largest ethnic group in Russia. So the sort of ethnic Russian history of Crimea is largely made up and is sort of mixed up then with the history of the Tsarist Empire, later of the Soviet Union. And also, if you look at the administrative history, both of the Tsarist Empire and of the Soviet Union, then the link, there's a strong link actually not so much with the current territory of the Russian Federation, but with the current territory of Ukraine, and both in the Soviet period and in the Tsarist period. So in the Tsarist period, Crimea was part of the Taurik gouvernement from 1802 till 1917, a gouvernement that covered a large part of what is today southern Ukraine. The most widely spoken language in the Taurik gouvernement was Little Russian, that is to say Ukrainian, not on Crimea, but on the whole in the Taurik gouvernement. And so there is actually an administrative historical link between today's mainland Ukraine and Russia. Then for the first 32 years of the history of the Soviet Union, from 1922 till 1954, indeed, Crimea was part of the Russian Socialist Federal Soviet Republic, but in 1954 it was transferred to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. And then there is a story here about that this was allegedly a sort of a decision by a drunken Khrushchev who has sort of single-handedly decided that. But if you know a little bit the history of the Soviet Union, in 1954, Khrushchev was not yet the sole leader. There was still a sort of collective leadership, and the whole process of
the sound is breaking up. Yeah.
Yes. Andreas, I'm afraid the connection doesn't run well in this moment. Can you hear me?
Of Crimea from the process of Crimea of the Crimean Tatars and other minorities. They were largely
Andreas, can you hear me? Because the connection doesn't function well. I have the feeling I've lost you. Can you hear me? Okay, Andreas will join us again shortly. Can you hear me, Andreas?
Yes, somebody seems to be boycotting our meeting.
Yeah, can you repeat what you were saying in the past couple of minutes, if you don't mind?
Yeah, I hope I think I stopped where, or the transmission stopped when I was talking about the transfer from of Crimea from the Russian to the Ukrainian Soviet Republic. So that happened, and as I said, it was an economic decision above all, and one of the major economic results then of this was also the building of the North Crimea Canal in the 1960s, which then until 2014 was supplying fresh water from the Dnipro River from mainland southern Ukraine to Crimea, and was closed in 2014. And that is, by the way, something Armand was saying, that, you know, maybe there may be no escalation. I hope so as well, but the conquering of this North Crimea Canal could be a possible aim of an expansion, of an escalation, in order to secure again freshwater supply for Crimea, which is of course an odd idea, an odd thing in a way, because there is a lot of water. It's just salt water and you know, seawater, which needs to be desalinated, but Russia has not managed to build, as far as I know, to build a single desalination plant on Crimea in the last 8 years. And the only desalination plant, as far as, if I'm correctly informed, has been actually built during the post-Soviet Ukraine time. The other argument that is sometimes proposed here in order to justify the annexation of Crimea is a sort of pseudo-legal one that refers to the already mentioned allegedly dubious transfer of Crimea from the Russian Soviet Republic to the Ukrainian Soviet Republic, which is an argument that reminds me a little bit of the Armenian argument about Karabakh. Yeah? So this is a sort of arbitrary decision. With Karabakh, it was Stalin. With Crimea, it was Khrushchev, and you know, why should we follow in the post-Soviet times these arbitrary decisions of the Soviet leaders? Yeah, so this is, and you know, why should these dubious personalities, Stalin in the case of Karabakh and Khrushchev in the case of allegedly Khrushchev in the case of Crimea, why should that now be sort of a rule for the post-Soviet period? The problem with this argument, at least for the case of Crimea, is that Russia has repeatedly accepted Crimea's belonging to Ukraine in treaties. In the most important, perhaps, treaty, the Belovesh Agreement of December 1991, when Shushkevich, Yeltsin, and Kravchuk, the representatives of Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine, got together and they signed the treaty that dissolved the Soviet Union. And the important thing here about this treaty, that this is a fully ratified treaty. It's not just a sort of a declaration. It's ratified by the parliaments of Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine. And it's not something that is just, you know, a misunderstanding. It's a valid treaty. And moreover, in 2003, Russia and Ukraine signed 1991, Yeltsin confirmed that Crimea belongs to Ukraine. In 2003, Putin, as president, during his first presidency, confirmed in this border treaty between Russia and Ukraine that Crimea belongs to Ukraine. And again, this is a fully ratified treaty, and signed by Putin. And so now, for some reason, that is all invalid because, and then you hear these stories because of history or because of demography or because of drunken Khrushchev and so on. So there's a very weak case here, and in fact, for this annexation, and I think it will actually at some point Crimea will return. One of the reasons, exactly being that the historical ties between Crimea and the Russian Federation are weak. Basically, the only sort of major Russian figure that was born on Crimea, it has sort of a larger meaning beyond Crimea, is a man called Ivan Ayvazovsky, a marine painter. And even with Ayvazovsky, the story is that the real name of Ivan Ayvazovsky is Yohannes Hovasyan. He is actually an Armenian, and his family has come to Crimea from Western Ukraine, from Galicia, of all places. But Ayvazovsky himself was born indeed on Crimea. And I'm saying that because I come from East Germany, and that one of the reasons that that I think that Crimea will eventually return to Russia, because these annexations, if you want to compare it to East Germany, are usually quite expensive, and I wonder whether the Russians will eventually be willing to pay the full bill. I also wanted to say something about the Minsk agreements, Steinmeier formula, but maybe actually Armando had already said most of the things that I would have also said. Maybe I'll finish on that.
Thank you very much, Andreas. Very provocative, indeed, very provocative. And I'm happy that we have listened to your presentation from a historical point of view, which is necessary. That was the nuance you added. Professor Diaconescu has a question for you, as far as I know. Please, Professor.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Umland, please tell me something. After the disintegration of USSR, there were many analyses, predictions, and studies about the annexation of Crimea by Russia. Please tell me, what did Ukraine do before 2014 to preserve Crimea? Because the analyst
what predicts, did Ukraine do to what?
To preserve Crimea.
Well, I think what needs to be explained is not that presumes somehow that there was something that was really an issue. I think there wasn't really an issue. The policies of Ukraine were fairly liberal. Crimea was an autonomous republic, and while officially the Ukrainian constitution said that Ukrainian is the only state language, in practice, actually that wasn't the case. Even not just on Crimea, but in many parts of southern eastern Ukraine, Russian was used, and the sort of the language discipline, so to say, has actually only appeared after the start of the war and after the annexation of Crimea. I think what happened actually was that Russia always wanted to get Crimea back, but it was until 2012 dependent on the Ukrainian gas transportation system, and basically what then happened to Crimea was simply what happened earlier to Transnistria and Abkhazia and South Ossetia. It was an almost natural development in a post-imperial space, where Ukraine had the luck to have had this gas transportation system, and to have made and to have this dependency of Russia from Ukraine until 2012. And once this goes away, then, basically to Crimea happens what usually happens in such situations. That is then annexation, war, and a failed state.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andreas. We have Misha Kemmel, our friend and colleague professor in the University of Amsterdam, joining us.
Thank you very much.
Not for the simple fact that you are Dutch.
I'm German, but I'm an adopted Dutchman. I'm not going to talk about that. Professor Umland, thank you very much. Dan Perry suggested, why don't we recognize Russia's right to keep Ukraine out of NATO? And anyways, we won't be able to include Ukraine into NATO without much bloodshed anyway. So it's not a real perspective for the future. What is your view on the Ukrainian perspective on this issue? Does Ukraine understand that it's this promise of 2008, this very vague promise that is causing much of this trouble? And how would Ukraine react if NATO, in a kind of negotiation, retract from this vague promise?
I will be very quick because I think Armando also needs to speak. Yeah, I don't, I think it's a made-up issue in a way because, Moldova declared in 1994 itself bloc-free and excluded NATO membership, but it still has the Transnistria problem and unwanted Russian troops on its territory. This promise was very vague in 2008. There were no signs from NATO over the last 14 years that this is on the agenda. There's no membership action plan. And, the problem here is rather for NATO. If NATO now says that this document from 2008 is not any longer valid, how would we then know that, let's say, Article 5 of the Washington Treaty is still valid for, let's say, a city like Narva in eastern Estonia, which is a largely Russian city? So I think the problem here is rather for NATO, actually, not so much for Ukraine. That Ukraine will not soon enter NATO is actually, something that has already been known.
Thank you very much, Andreas, and thank you, Misha, for the questions, and thank you for Andreas' intervention. Now it's your time, Armando. Professor Marques from the University of Lisbon. Please, Armando. Let me just add a couple of things. You had some days ago a fantastic lecture called The Past as Present. Are the US, Germany, and Russia at it again, which was extremely interesting and illuminating in the way of how history repeats itself. I will also take the opportunity to greet Professor Radu Karp, who came to us a bit later, but I'm happy you're here. Armando, please.
Thank you very much, Mihai. It's great to see you. It's great to see Andreas. It's great to see Professor Diaconescu, and it's great to meet all of you guys. In a difficult position, being the last to speak of the beginners, much of what I wanted to say was said already. So I'll just press on these points, and perhaps introduce a new one. I'll try to keep the time correct. So let me begin with something that Armand said, which I deeply agree with. Minsk II, the Minsk agreements, I actually published in a newspaper an article about this, are terms of surrender. There is no other way to put it. I wrote a paper about this, claiming that this would make, for an indeterminate amount of time, Ukraine dependent on the Russian Federation. If that is what Putin now wants to get back to, that would be disastrous for Ukraine. And I suspect it is. I think this is particularly interesting as a point to be further discussed, because I think it is going to happen. On the other hand, again, touching upon what Armand said, it's the same name as mine, isn't it? Armando, Armand. It comes from the German Hermann, which is even more interesting. As Armand said, yes, I mean, I'm not very convinced with the eventual potential success of Macron's 7-hour talk with Putin. I think Macron was trying to save the flag, was trying a bromance as he did with Trump, with Putin now. I think perhaps the closest parallel is what in 2008, Sarkozy did when trying to negotiate with the Russians because of Georgia, the first invasion. I actually wrote a book about this, not Sarkozy's talk, but about the Russian invasion. I called it the 5-Day War, which was published in the Portuguese military, and which I hope to see republished. I have it translated into English and updated, hopefully with Andreas in your series. It would be an immense honor to me. Now, let me focus on two things which I think are particularly important. One is, since I'm a law professor, let me repeat something from a slightly different angle that was magnificently exposed by Andreas Umland, Professor Umland here, i.e. the implicit Russian recognition of Ukraine in legally binding treaties. So let me focus on this first, and then I will go to another thing, which again, Andreas talked about, which is the non-existence of Ukraine as a nation state in generic terms, but I'll break this up. Let me start first with the boring legal issues. The repeated implicit Russian recognition of Ukraine as a state and of Crimea as part of Ukraine are manifolds. In many cases, Russia did this. Let me just say, name a few. In fully ratified treaties, which not only legal force and efficacy, but also with constitutional force within Russia, according to the Russian constitution. When the time came for the breakup of the Soviet Union, Ukraine was recognized as a state by Russia, as was Belarus, as that was not the case, at least not immediately, with the Baltics, as was the case with a variety of other things. But Ukraine, let's keep that focus, was implicitly recognized in a legally binding international treaty with constitutional force within the Russian Federation when this happened. When you all remember the nukes in Ukraine went back to Russia, well, those that did, those that didn't disappear, when the nukes went back to Russia in the Budapest Memorandum, isn't that correct? The USA, the UK, and Russia, together with the EU, and I think NATO and a variety of other people who came in later, signed a memorandum which is legally binding, not with the same force as the treaty, but legally binding, guaranteeing the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Russia signed this so as to get their nukes back, or what they thought they were their nukes, so as to make Ukraine nuclear free, not a nuclear power. It would have become, I think, the third or the fourth biggest nuclear power in the world had it kept it. If it had kept two, none of this, neither Georgia nor Ukraine, would have happened. It was, I think, a historical mistake, but that's another conversation. More than this, when between Georgia and Ukraine, the access to Sevastopol for 50 years in Crimea was renewed. This renewal, under the umbrella of an international treaty, had legal force as well. And implicitly, Russia was recognizing that it had the rights to keep for more 50 years, up to 25,000 troops, if I'm correct, in Sevastopol. So it is, let me use the word BS to say that it is not a state, and Russia does not really recognize it as a state. It's an entity. It's Ukraine, the edge of Russia. It's really Russia. This, from a legal point of view, is utter nonsense. I mean, it will be sunk in any international court at any moment in time if it is brought up, as it was by the General Assembly of the UN, as it was by the in which only 10 countries voted for, North Korea, Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Russia. 100 countries voted saying it's illegal, the annexation, the Anschluss of Ukraine. Let me use this. Let me go back to the Anschluss metaphor. I think we all remember the famous speech Putin gave in Crimea at the time of the Anschluss. I was going to write an article about it. I still have the notes I made for the article. It is virtually identical to Hitler's Sudetenland Anschluss, and I think it was deliberately so, as a taunting political speech, so as to challenge the West. What I'm saying is this: when he claimed that the annexation of Crimea, let me make it very clear, in his famous speech, Putin deliberately used the template of, compared them to, the two of them, the Sudetenland speech by Hitler. And I think this was deliberate as a taunting thing, also as a mechanism that worked. Now, let me go back to finish to what Andreas, referring to me, mentioned. Grateful that you referred to me, because this is, of course, my position. That is the Ukraine really a nation state? Is it not part of Russia? Since Catherine the Great, hasn't it been ours? Hasn't it been part of us? Isn't it our edge, our Ukraine? How many? What is the national identity of Ukraine? Is Ukraine really a nation state? Aren't there three Ukraines: a Polish Ukraine, a Ukrainian Ukraine, and a Russian-speaking Ukraine? This is gibberish. Yes, as Andreas said, there's more than one Ukraine, but there's three Switzerlands as well, if you want to go that way. And there's a Romance-speaking Switzerland, a German-speaking Switzerland, and a French-speaking Switzerland. Belgium is divided into the Flemish part and the non-Flemish part. Canada is divided in Quebec and non-Quebec. Look, in your face, the unity, i.e. the lack of divisions in Ukraine, the unity and the lack of divisions in Ukraine is smaller than the unity, well, is bigger, the unity, and the lack of divisions is smaller than in the Russian Federation. Think North Caucasus, think Siberia. The Russian Federation has much less of a national identity in that abstract sense than Ukraine does. And I think this is a point worth looking at, because it turns the table on them. I mean, the North Caucasus has an incredibly fast population growth, I think between 5 and 7 reposition rate, whilst Russia is dwindling down demographically drastically. The numbers, the projections I saw is that by 2050, 50% or more of the Russian armed forces will be North Caucasian Muslims, which will be a problem for Russia. I don't think Ukraine has this sort of problem. I mean, not about Muslims, but about the divisions within the armed forces of Ukraine. Moreover, national identity, of course, is an organic entity which grows. And since 2014, boy, has the Ukrainian identity been reinforced by the Donbass, by the annexation of Crimea, by the Russian spiel, the Russian talks, discourse about the lack of a real nation in Ukraine. This is simply not true. So let me finish this very quickly, very, very, very quickly. I won't bother you anymore. In terms of scenarios, future scenarios. I loved what Dan said at the beginning. To my mind, there are 2 scenarios, and I want to add something here. 2 scenarios which are very possible. Will this move by Putin now get into results into an invasion? I really don't think so. I think it's posturing, and I hope not. I think it is posturing, but more than this, I think there's 2 possible models for an outcome in which no one loses face. One is the Austrian outcome after World War II, when the Soviets withdrew and Austria became neutral. That is one possibility. And the second is the Finland hypothesis, which is very similar, but with differences. I think this is 2 hypotheses that I think would be a potential solution, which would mean, of course, both Austria and Finland are not members of NATO, but are members of the EU. I don't think Russia will accept Ukraine becoming a member of the EU, because that would want a lot of Russians wanting to become a member of the EU as well. And I think Putin is not ready for that. That's not part of his Weltanschauung. And I think that's very difficult. A second and last point I want to make is the following. Putin, and this has not been mentioned here yet, has been in meetings and talks, long talks, far more than 7 hours, with Xi Jinping and with the Chinese, claiming that they're I mean, this sounds to me like the Valdai meetings and the Karaganov's geopolitical eagle with 2 heads looking at the East and the West, and we're friends, where the Chinese are going to eat them alive. Russia has no money for it. My expectation, and this is guesswork, and I'll end with this, my guesswork is there's going to be a lend and lease program in which China will finance the troop movements, which Russia cannot afford to continue this. Notice the positioning of the 130,000 troops on the borders in Belarus and in Russia, near the eastern border of Ukraine. The position is not an attack position or a defense position, it's an exercise position. I mean, I checked this with the military, and they said this is done. I mean, there is no way Russia will be able to finance a war unless, as happened to the Soviet Union, a lend and lease program is extended by China. China loves indebting countries in relation to them, and then throwing a Marshall Plan 2.0 over Russia. So I totally agree with Andreas. Not surprisingly, I read pretty much everything that Andreas wrote and love it, I must say. He's the person in the world I know who knows more about Ukraine, together with Timothy Snyder. I think these are, I really don't, I think this is bluffing, posturing by Russia, unless, because Putin centrally decides whatever he wants to decide. I think this will, unless there's a face-saving mechanism, there's going to be trouble. Little green men will show up. Hybrid asymmetrical movements into Ukraine will appear. The Wagner group will get involved. I'm just guessing. You know, mercenaries of all types, guys going on holidays to Ukraine will create trouble all over. They will move downwards from Belarus. They will go up to the Sowalski Gap and create troubles there. Again, this is something that was not mentioned yet, between Lithuania and Belarus and Poland, and that long area that NATO has considered for a long time as the most dangerous place in the world. Kaliningrad will get an importance that it hasn't had yet. I'm still waiting for the exercises and simulated nuclear attacks on Stockholm, on Denmark, on all the neighboring countries. And the joint exercises with the Russians in the Eastern Baltic, and now the Iranians in naval exercises together with the Russians and the Chinese. This is if you look at the big picture, things are much worse than they look. It looks much more like an exercise of posturing. It looks like an attempt to break the unity in the European Union. It is working. Orban went in 2014 to Moscow to talk to Putin. Orban went again now to talk to Putin. So Hungary is not behaving like a European or a NATO country. I think it's going to be whacked for that. Germany is vacillating. So France is trying to posture. Macron, like Sarkozy, are trying to take the upper hand. I don't think they will be able to do that. But I think, to a large extent, Putin already won some points in terms of reputational points. He also got negative reputational points, but to a large extent he did. Rolling him back without losing face is going to be hard, and that's all I wanted to say for now.
Thank you so much, Armando. Absolutely fantastic what you said. It was extremely interesting. I have a question that, profiting of the fact that you both, Armando and Andreas, you're still with us. One question that is addressed to both of you. What is the role of Zelinski? Is Zelinski an actor or a politician? Well, who would start? Who'd like to?
Let me maybe start then. Yeah. I think he has become a politician. He is still not a professional politician in all ways, and in particular his cadre policy has not been that well. But he has turned out to be, largely in foreign affairs, especially, and in the relationship with Russia, largely on the same page as Poroshenko. I mean, there has been from my point of view, a ridiculous discussion here about this flawed or this aborted operation to catch some Wagner fighters, and he aborted this operation, and that why people now think he is not a good leader. But that was such a risky operation that I was actually wondering how they ever came up with it, bringing down an airplane and then somehow arresting these professional soldiers without civilian, fatalities. I think it was very good that they did not do that because it was just too risky. So that is something that has become here a big issue in Ukraine, unjustifiably so. And he has now become a quite hawkish politician. I think that's actually also one of the reasons that we now see this escalation, that it has turned out that the issue was with Ukraine was not the president. It looked until 2019, if Ukraine would only get another president than Poroshenko, who was hated and is hated in Russia, then things would turn out differently. But Zelinski partly, largely actually continued what Poroshenko has been doing.
Thank you, Andreas. Armando, what is your opinion?
My opinion is very similar to Andreas. Again, not surprisingly. My opinion is, of course, I think Zelinski was a politician from the beginning. He's now a mature politician, much more mature since he had to deal with Trump, with the accusations of Biden's son having been co-opted by Ukraine and whatever. He hardened himself. The Wagner Group case was an excellent example of how he managed to deal with a hard situation without any harm being set on Ukraine's image or reputation, or any casus belli that would possibly, difficult because they're mercenaries, so the Russians would always claim that they don't represent Russia. They're the Blackwater of the Russians out there. I think Zelinski is all since the very beginning, Yanukovych, etc., to the chocolate man, I think Zelinski is the best leader that Ukraine has had in years. Let us hope he continues to be that. Let us hope he has American support. I'm still very puzzled. This is slightly away from it, by this kind of conversation in which Nord Stream 2 is out of the table, Scholz said, the German chancellor, and the Americans said, Biden did, we'll take care of it, with Scholz smiling. Was there a hidden agreement there? Will Russia be taken out of SWIFT? If it is taken out of SWIFT, boy, will that be a victory for Ukraine. If Nord Stream 2 doesn't happen, will that be a victory for Ukraine and a defeat for Russia? Contingency planning for alternative heating gas to Europe has begun already. Did we forget that when Russia cut oil supplies and to punish the Baltics, two American ships with liquid natural gas came. One was called Freedom, the ships, the other was called Liberty, to bring liquid natural gas to the Baltics. Of course, the Baltics are very small compared to Germany, and Germany is 80% dependent on the gas. I'm sure alternative solutions, American reserves will be brought over, European reserves will be turned over. Portugal and Spain receive our gas. We receive our gas from Algeria. So we can channel it north. There's quite a variety of solutions. Spring is coming. So gas will not be as important as all that. That's my reaction. Sorry if it was a bit disconcerting in this part.
Thank you, Armando. Now, prior to ask Sebastian to jump in, I have some things to ask And just briefly, Andreas, because I know that you're hurrying out.
I have to go too in 5 minutes or so because I have a jury, an academic jury.
Okay, I'll take care about this. You're in my hands anyway. So just briefly, Andreas, what role does Belarus play in Russia-Ukraine's relations? That was one question coming to you, and another question coming to Armando. Is there a nostalgia for the USSR that could, in a way, furnish the energies of changing borders that have been internationally recognized? So these are the two questions that our public addressed to you. Andreas.
Yeah, on Belarus, I mean, currently it has, of course, a very threatening sort of quality in that it has become a space for Russian troops to be stationed and to threaten now Ukraine also from the north. And, you know, I'm speaking now from Kyiv. Now, actually, you know, Kyiv is relatively close to Russian troops with these now exercises also going on there. This is frightening. In general, however, you know, Belarus with these protests in 2020 has rather unexpectedly become a problem for Russia. And you know, there are even some people even argue that the whole fuss about Ukraine is basically created in order to now, when attention is on Ukraine, is basically to take control of Belarus. That's actually the sort of the game plan. I mean, you know, sounds sensible, and objectively, I think that's actually the case. That, you know, there's so much attention now on Ukraine that Belarus and what is happening there is sort of out under the radar. And but the, you know, at the end of the day, you know, like with Ukraine, the Belarusians don't want that, and you know, it's also going to be a temporary sort of capture by Russia. So it will, I think, sooner or later yet become another headache for Moscow.
Thank you very much, Andreas. Yes, indeed, the respite for the situation in Belarus and for Lukashenko himself was not now making any first-page titles anymore, as it was the case some weeks ago. Thank you, Andreas. So, Armando, how would you answer your question?
The not nostalgic Russian take on Ukraine, and particularly on Crimea, because that, of course, was the place where the top dogs of the Politburo had their dachas and whatever. Beautiful Crimea with the nice beaches and whatever. Fast backwards rather than fast forwards. You remember when Saakashvili saw Russian troops in 2008 come into Georgia, to South Ossetia, because of the Russian peacekeepers. First 1,100, and actually there were 10 were shelled. Saakashvili, to my mind, was tricked by the Russians into doing this. Okay, that was the explanation to go there. But why did they go to Abkhazia? What I heard from Russian officers is were general officers. This, when we were young captains and we didn't have the money and the possibility of going to Crimea, we went to Abkhazia. So there's a kind of historical memory and longing for the Abkhazia. I think the Russians feel the same for Crimea, but again, agreeing with Andreas, Andreas didn't state this, but he actually wrote a paper and published a paper on this. I think Crimea, he said today, will eventually go back to Ukraine because the Russians do not have the money to support it. Of course, there are no Tatars anymore to take over, to get it back. So its home will be, very interestingly, I think you know this, Andreas, you know much more than I think all of us know about Ukraine. But when Khrushchev in the mid-50s swapped, because it was a swap, he did not give Crimea to the part of the federation, which was federal Ukraine. He swapped it for black earth, a surface almost the same size on the northeast. Not only that, but he did not sign the papers giving it. 3 members of the Politburo did, Khrushchev did not. So the idea that Khrushchev sold it off because his father was Ukrainian is absurd. That was a land swap in which Khrushchev hid his hand behind it, and it was a way, to my mind, to guarantee that if things went wrong, Sebastopol would continue existing, say 20 or 30 years in the future. I think Khrushchev was a visionary after the Cuban Missile Crisis. How could he not have been? But this is just guesswork. I think there is a sense of longing. I think a lot of Russians and a lot of Ukrainians think that Russia and Ukraine have a lot great history in common. The Kievan Rus narrative, which is partly false, but partly true, is very important. The Kievan Rus, in fact, was a construct copycatting the Principality and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Rus actually is a Karelian Finnish name, which means Swede, isn't it? The Kievan Rus created Russia. It was the bedrock or the maternity for Russia. No, for Muscovy. Copying the example of the Lithuanians before the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, that is, or at the beginnings of it. I think if we unfold the narratives behind it, this is all propaganda, isn't it? As would be expected in situations of tension. I don't believe either of the sides. And from that point, and I'll finish, Zelinski is becoming a real politician if he denounces these things with a little help from Western intellectuals who have the time and the peace to write papers about it and to kind of unravel the Russian narrative about what is going on and about what the longing is. Come on, the majority of Ukrainians now are furious at Russia since 2014, aren't they? I would be. I mean, that's all I really have to go, unfortunately.
Thank you very much, Armando. Thank you very much. It was so interesting to hear your historical perspective onto the national myths of Ukraine, which is very much fitting the truth. Thank you, both of you, Andreas and Armando. I know that you have to leave, but I succeeded to trick you into staying with us for another half an hour almost, which is fantastic.
Which was great. And thank you, Mihai, for the invitation. Thank you, Andreas. I think we should talk more.
Thank you to both of you.
Thank you for everyone. It was great to... Radukar possibly does not remember me, but I gave a talk chaired by you at the university.
I remember you. I remember you very well. I remember you very well.
And I remember you.
And I hope to see you in person while in Bucharest or in Lisbon or anywhere else.
Take care.
Thank you very much, Armando and Andreas. Thank you. We keep in touch anyway. We
keep in touch, Mihai. Thank you, Mihai. Thank you, Andrea.
I now turn to Sebastian. Sebastian, you have witnessed lots of perspectives coming from different corners of our world. What would be yours? How would you see the situation in the eastern part of our continent from Vienna? Actually, from the IDN, from the closest neighborhood possible.
Well, thank you, Mihai. There's a famous saying by a Bavarian comedian, Karl Valentin, who said, "Everything has been said, but not yet by everyone," which is actually also the start of an article I recently published that had the title "A Piece of Our Time," meaning part, and not mir, where I try to argue that a lot more than just the peace in Ukraine and the lives that are constantly still being lost there are at stake. And this is a point for all of us, and we should be much more aware of that. And you know, our good common friend and also the chairman of IDM, Dusek, he always says that Bregenz is as far away as from Vienna as Ushgorod. And we are not aware of this. And I'm a bit afraid that we are repeating mistakes that we have done already in 2014. I found it interesting in the discussion, I took some notes, that we are discussing the viability of borders, that we are discussing the viability of identities. It's always that when there is these historic sentiments coming up, that countries are always thinking back to the times when they had the largest expansion. But that can't work altogether, right? Why aren't we focusing on a time where the most promising development for our societies was the biggest expansion? And if we then realize that that hasn't been the case yet, maybe this is what we should strive for in the future. And when we talk about the legitimate security interests that Russia, and especially the Kremlin, is always bringing to the table, we should not forget that also there are legitimate security interests of Ukraine. Now, I like very much the discussion about if a EU enlargement is not the better option than a NATO enlargement. I think this is a phantom discussion anyway, because none of the NATO member countries would actually allow Ukraine to join in the foreseeable future. If this is a mistake or not, it's a different discussion. But the EU membership of Ukraine as some sort of substitute for a alleviation of that situation is a lovely thought, and I very much appreciate what Andreas wrote about this. We've stated back in 2009 at the start of the Eastern Partnership that all target countries should have this membership perspective, but what will be problematic at that point is exactly what has also been mentioned before, is the value community. Because why are Russian troops standing at the borders? They are constantly creating this threat situation so that the Ukraine can't focus on other reforms that would be necessary. But at the same time, if they would be successful in these reforms, which are direly necessary and will take some time, but if they are successful with these reforms, this is the biggest threat to the Kremlin, because then the Russian society would realize, if the Ukrainian population can do that, we can do that too, and this is the end of the Putin regime. So you constantly hold this as a threat, and you've asked, is Zelinski an actor or a politician? I would say he's a reactor, because he's forced to always react to those things. And then the investment and the money that is secured not for the reform in the country, the economic development, but is put into the military and into several pockets along the way until they actually arrive in the field, so to say. And the question of how can we get out of this? I think there have been interesting scenarios described. I'm not sure if we should talk about the most realistic one. I would rather propose a scenario what finally from the side of the West, the European Union, the democratic community should be done. And this is take the harsh steps now. Make it absolutely clear that this, if anything occurs, if anything happens that resembles anything to what is already ongoing since 2014 in Ukraine, be prepared that you will, as I think Blinken mentioned, these sanctions from hell, because we are able to secure a vast amount of money if a banking crisis and an economic crisis and a financial crisis happens. We are ready to bring go back into a lot of debt as when the pandemic hits, in order to help containing the spread of the virus. But we are not ready to actually react to a even higher gas price and immediately take a lot of money into our hands to finally get out of this gas trap. It's something that we have known for years and years and decades even, that we need to transform. And if the European Union wants to be not only a viable foreign policy actor, but wants to bring forward their big project that this Commission has launched, the European Green Deal, then the time to actually act would be now, and say, look, we are subsidizing the higher prices that would occur from further dwindling gas supplies. We are ready to bail out whoever gets in trouble due to economic problems that are resulting from harsher sanctions. Because if we look at the state of the Union, and it has been mentioned how the High Representative Josep Borrell has been humiliated basically on live TV by Lavrov, a person that is in office since 2004 or 3 or whatever, where we should know what is happening and where we should know how he behaves. We continue to let Putin go on with his strategy of divide and conquer. He gives Orban preferential treatment when it comes to gas supplies because he signs a long-term contract with Gazprom, which he promptly uses to run his electoral campaign. In this case, if we let this happen as a democratic community, as a value community, as it has been mentioned, and as the European Union, there is no way out of this, and therefore I would propose a strong signal, because trying to understand and trying to get into a dialogue and take into account the different feelings that are out there have led us exactly to that situation. And there's more than just the Ukrainian future at stake. There is the peace in Europe and the future of democracy at stake here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. Yes, indeed. You have brought into the discussion a different perspective. I have a question for you. It comes from our public. If there is a key to solve this ongoing tension that has already lasted for the past 80 years, since 2014, where would you look for that key? Provided there are enough political personalities who might be at least imagining it, if not having it. Paris, Berlin, or across the ocean? What would you say?
So, I mean, I do understand, because when I talk to different people from the different countries that are targeted within these conundrum that we've witnessed building up over the past couple of weeks, I do understand that why a perspective of Ukraine being a NATO member is problematic. That has strategic military reasons. There is the defense capability of the Russian Federation that would be at stake. And I would also not say that you cannot know how actually the situation in Washington is developing. And we should look more from also a perspective that there is no good guy and bad guy, which is far too often perpetuated in that situation. So Moscow thinks they're the good guys, and the Americans are threatening. Washington thinks that they are the good guys that bring about freedom and democracy, and the Russians are the bad guys. That is, of course, never in politics, especially in real politics, true. So what's the key? I mean, if we don't trust each other, and if a membership in NATO of my neighboring country poses a security threat to myself, then the easiest key would be join NATO as well. And then these security problems are gone. Now, of course, I mean, you know, that's NATO also sees itself based on values, free democratic countries, etc., etc. So the second best key then probably would be to find again a mutual defense agreement that provides all these guarantees to all the countries concerned. But the key must fit also into a lock, and I think the lock is the long-term threat of a democratic development of Ukraine to the Kremlin, and not the security threat that a possible NATO enlargement, not expansion. NATO is not expanding, NATO is enlarging. That's a voluntary membership that each and every country does and has. Yeah.
Thank you, Sebastian. Yeah, one of our younger colleagues addressed you two questions, but I have to negotiate with you about them. There is one which is pretty technical, but you know the answer. So it runs like this. Given the fact that Hungary is blocking the accession of Ukraine to the Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of NATO, and Orban visited Moscow, is there for Hungary increasingly professing a different position from the common position of EU and NATO? And if Misha is ready to take a question from the floor, I would be most the happiest actually, if Misha can. Are you for a 5-minute answer ready to a question?
I don't know what the question is, but yes, please.
Okay, I'll deliver the question. I'll then ask Sebastian to answer, and then yourself. Thank you once again, Misha. So Misha, again from one of our younger colleagues, do you think that the strategy of the Russian Federation to destabilize the European Union has worked so far? That was the question. Sebastian, you have the floor.
Thank you. I think I don't want to speak too long, and the answer is pretty simple. Yes, we've seen that Hungary has been undermining not only NATO in that case now that has been mentioned, but especially a further development of the European Union with regards to several aspects, be it rule of law, but also be it economically, actually, when we look where we stand. And that is the fundamental flaw of the European Union itself, because all the member states, for internal political reasons and short-term personal political gain, can exploit the current structure as the European Union is. And that is true when it comes to enlargement, what we've seen from France, the Netherlands, or recently Bulgaria. And that is true when it comes to foreign policy acting, which has been done by Germany and which is done by Orban. And we could find other policy areas where I could name all 27 EU member states, or even former EU member states that have acted this way. And that doesn't lead us anywhere.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. Yeah, that was a very comprehensive answer. Misha?
Yeah, the question was whether Putin managed to split the European Union or Europe or the West. And here my assumption would be he did the opposite. He united many countries of Europe behind the US, because the US is so decisive. And the European countries, even Germany or France, will not be able to do anything without Washington. So we're being dragged into this game, and China, of course, is another factor, because Russia seems for the US just like a proxy of China. The European countries speak about sanctions, but I hear very little about how the consequences of these sanctions will return to Europe. If we're being cut off from gas, for instance, it will be a disaster. It will be a major disaster, and we're simply blocking that out at the moment. Right? We're doing as if economic sanctions would hit Russia and thereby guarantee the safety of Ukraine, which is far from clear. First of all, whether they work, whether they really deter, and second, if they are in place, whether we will be able to maintain them at huge costs. So for the time being, we're hiding behind the US and not moving out of the shadow of Washington. At the same time, as Dan already said in the very first statement, the US is very weak at the moment, with Biden's position very much undermined at home. And it's very difficult to forespell how much he will be ready to invest in Europe. So it looks very bleak. At the same time, if Putin managed to do something, he managed to unite the West. And who is Orban? Orban is not really a player. He's a nuisance to NATO, not more. Which means it's counterproductive for Putin if you consider that his strategy was to divide the West. So that's my modest intervention.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Misha. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I'll turn to Professor Karp. How would you comment the last two speakers of ours?
I have listened very carefully to what everyone said. And I think we are all in a trap in a way, because we focus too much on what Putin would like to do, and we don't want to focus, in general speaking, to the current situation on the ground, to what is going on in Ukraine, in Belarus, and what is going on in the diplomatic shuttles that are underway. I think that we need to have a more comprehensive way of understanding, as it was until now in this discussion. I think this is the best way to go forward in order to understand the reasons of the current situation. Why? Because, for example, about Ukraine, we need to deeply understand what is behind the refusal of Ukrainian authorities to implement Minsk agreement as it was signed some years ago. There are, I think, in my opinion, there are deep reasons why Ukraine is refusing such a step. From outside, it seems to be a normal step of, I don't know, decentralization or federalization. But for Ukraine, it will be a tremendous step that the state in the current shape cannot support. And I think that we need to be very careful in assessing the Ukrainian position I think that we need to shift our understanding and to say, in the current forms, no matter how the content is negotiated, the Minsk agreement can be implemented by Ukraine, because it will mean not only an autonomy for the people on the ground, but the disintegration of other regions of Ukraine. So I think the whole thing needs to be rediscussed, and I think that also Ukrainian authorities have to be encouraged to be more straight in defining what they really want and what they really can offer to this problem, because I think this is central. If we look back on how the crisis started, it's obvious that it started from the different interpretation of the Minsk agreements, and it is not only a diplomatic issue, it's not only a technical issue, it is also a political one. And I think we have to put everything on the table very seriously and to find a new solution. I don't know, maybe some other actors want to be involved and maybe they have other solutions. But I think this is the key to understand and also to end this conflict. Because what we see until now, we see some efforts of European leaders and US leaders to discuss with the Russian leaders, but there is a wall of separation between different meanings they have on NATO expansion, on security in Europe, and so on. Why? Because I think we have to we neglect in a way how Ukraine can cope with the current situation. I'm not speaking here from a military perspective, because it's obvious that even for the military perspective, we still don't have an answer. But I'm talking here about a political perspective, and I think that we need to discuss more with Ukrainian leaders. In theory, European leaders are saying that, and US leaders are saying that they will not go forward even a step without discussing with Ukrainian partners. But I think that more visits on the ground are needed to Kyiv, but also on the front line, also in the separatist regions, in order to understand better. And I think there is a hope, because I see that in the last visits of European leaders, they paid a visit to Kyiv, but also to those regions, which is essential in order to understand the conflict. I don't know what will follow, because we know very well that Putin likes to be unpredictable. He enjoys to be unpredictable, and therefore we cannot predict even for the next day what will happen. I mean, he promised that the troops from Belarus will be out after the military exercise. Let's follow this development and let's see if this promise will be kept. We have no guarantee. We have no guarantee about a containment of his intentions in Ukraine. We have no guarantee about what will happen in Belarus. And therefore, I think we need to change the paradigm of interpretation and to really include Ukraine as a partner, and to increase the contacts with Ukrainians at all levels. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you very much for your complementary point of view to what's been said until now. Yes, that's a matter of thought right now. But I will come back to Misha for another supplementary question. If Misha is still loaded with energy, brilliant. And then I will ask Professor Diaconescu to go on the conclusions of our podcast, asking the same time Sebastian to stay with us, and if needed to ask something else, I hope that you can jump in. Now, the question for you, Misha, coming from a colleague of ours who's professor of economy in Italy. She says, I quote, "I do not want to underestimate the importance of treaties or hypotheses viewed from a historical point of view, but I am speaking from the point of view of an economist. Don't you think that the money factor, that is what Russia lacks, as Professor Guedes said, plays an important role? Russia is, after all, a very important player in the European energy market and would not like to lose this role." And for Professor Diaconescu, there is also a question coming from our public. How do Romanian observers evaluate the option that Russia could infiltrate from the Black Sea coast, also strengthening Transnistria and getting it out of the blockade? So, Misha, I'm turning to you now.
The money question. First of all, Russia is much less depending on the economic benefits that it gets from its foreign affairs, simply because the population is used to being put under pressure. At the same time, this brings us back to the question, why is Putin surrounding Ukraine, which is actually doing, at this point? Is this really a measure directed towards a foreign policy goal, namely to get Ukraine into its orbit or to press NATO out of Central Eastern Europe? Or is it all just another step up of the pressure at home? Is it a factor of domestic policies in order to create a radical tension in Russian society that allows him to repress their own population and to remain in power? Yeah? So the money factor is, of course, something that is a part of the legitimacy of the regime. A regime has an input and an output legitimacy. The input legitimacy is money comes in. The output legitimacy, sorry, the other way around, output legitimacy. Input legitimacy is the values and the ideas that the population is supposed to stand behind and that are represented by the government. Yeah? So to a certain degree, you can cut down on the income, or the output legitimacy of a regime if you can compensate that with income, with input legitimacy, with value legitimacy, with solidarity out of intellectual considerations. But at one point, this breaks down. So while we have been looking at foreign policy, it might also be interesting to look at how this all plays out in Russia. Yeah? Other factors come in, like Kazakhstan, the failed transition in Kazakhstan. What does this mean for a transition of power in Russia? Does it put it all on a block? Put it all on the long? Does it shelve it all, or are there more options for a transition of the regime in Russia? So, in a nutshell, I would say the economy plays for Putin less of a role than for Western countries.
Thank you very much, Misha. That's a very exhaustive answer to the question of what would money do in political terms, if they would be of help to Russia or not, whether we should follow their road to see exactly what is Russia heading to. And now I turn to Professor Diaconescu. Transnistria?
I think Transnistria is just a scarecrow. Of course, the Romanian observers wrote a lot of analysis in newspapers, online or printed one. And for them, Transnistria scenarios are one of the last. Because the conqueror of South Ukraine, from Crimea until Transnistria, could be more expensive for Russia. And because of that, I think it's on the third or fourth scenarios. All the time, Russia uses Transnistria as a scarecrow because with Transnistria, Russia put pressure on two targets, Ukraine's one and Moldavia, Chisinau seconds. I think it's not important in this moment, Transnistria, for the Russian conflict. I want to come back to a question about the role of Hungary in this split of European Union, but I think we give too much attention to Viktor Orban visiting Moscow. Of course, he's a gamer, not just a player, because he tried to do the best for his country, and we have to understand his actions in Russia, with Russia or with China, through historical mentality of his people. And maybe we have to understand that Viktor Orban, or maybe all of his politicians, Minister of Foreign Affairs, for example, Szijjártó and others, try to connect Hungary with all the countries which can give more value to his country. And the economic ground is the most important, because from security point of view, Hungary is in NATO and nobody will affect the integrity of Hungary. And today, or yesterday, I forgot, Szijjártó told that Hungary will not accept the new NATO troops because the Hungarian army is NATO troop, NATO army. I want to say a couple of conclusions to our podcast, because I want to say from another perspective, another approach. I think the key question in this Russian-Ukrainian conflict is how each important actor involved can come out honorable, how can exit honorable. Every state that matters in this question must have an honorable exit. Of course, which are important states, important actors? First of all, Russia, and Putin has to be successful diplomatically or militarily. That doesn't matter for him. He is willing to sacrifice thousands of people, soldiers, it's necessary, but he can stay empty-handed. And I think the other side, the Americans, the Germans, the European Union, knows that. The United States will accept concessions, officially negotiated by other partners, not directly by them, because they will accept, the United States will accept a bearable cost. The most bearable cost could be the lowering the trust of Eastern European partners, because just this cost will be in relationship of European countries with the United States. The Great Britain is heavily involved for at least two reasons. First of all, London needs an alternative to the European market, which it lost with the Brexit, and the United States is the ideal partner. On the other hand, the British pride does not allow the breach of the commitment made in Budapest in 1995 on the occasion of a memorandum by which Ukraine renounced its nuclear weapons in exchange for a security guarantee. Great Britain wants to pose as a global power, and for the London point of view, the British pride to be a guarantor in not just Europe, in all the world, is very important. The rest of states don't really care. The European Union has failed to have a strong and united voice on this security issue. This crisis has highlighted a major vulnerability of the European Union, the lack of cohesion in foreign security policy. In Central Europe, there is a core of Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Croatia, which has sent clear messages in favor of Russia, regardless of the interest of Eastern European states. And France, which boasts of President Macron's diplomatic success, seems to have opened Pandora's box. We will probably know in a few years what kind of concessions are being made to Russia today. Now, we can only speculate, but history teaches us that whenever the spheres of influence are divided between the great powers, the small states have something to lose, because they are not at the negotiation table, but in the menu on the table. I don't think the main menu is Ukraine. Putin's stakes are beyond Ukraine. He wants to impose Russia as a global power. It is not for nothing that Russia is involved in Syria, in Libya, and now in Mali, in Sahel. On the other hand, it is clear that the European security architecture have to be rebuilt, have to be reorganized. It was to be expected because no international treaty is eternal. Nothing is jure perpetuo et irrevocabiliter, because during the history, we have no more than 50 or 60 years without a war, without a reorganizing of security architecture here in Europe. And the last idea, I think that Romania and the Republic of Moldova will be again, not for the first time in the history of Romanians, as a menu to be served at the table of negotiation between the great powers. Maybe after a couple of years, we will know better what was or will be negotiated between Russia and other powers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Diaconescu. And what I hope is that you will be in the years to come a false prophet, because we
I hope to.
It's not exactly the perspective, the sunny perspective we all hope for. Well, dear friends and colleagues, we have already stroked 2 hours of our podcast. I cannot be but very but the warmest thanks to Sebastian and to Misha. Sebastian giving us a lot of his time. Misha battling just like Dan Perry with the virus, and I have the feeling that he already won the battle with the virus, since we were so active and so present with us. I'm grateful to Armando, Radu Karp, Marius Diaconescu, and to all of you who have given a couple of hours of your time to enjoy this continuous flow of interesting perspective, interpretations, and ideas. I turn for a couple of minutes to our younger colleagues, and I have the feeling that Dr. Albulescu and Dr. Mustăța would like to jump into the discussion. So please, let's use the last minutes in the best way possible.
Well, yes, thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. And if I turn to the question that has been put for this podcast to our team, what happens next? If you, for example, if you look at the existing diplomatic talks, even today, for example, the foreign secretary has been in Moscow. If you look at French president's visit to Moscow and the expected German Chancellor visit next week, I think will be very interesting to see if we, in the end, reach, for example, a common position on the responses that we need to give to Russia. And I'm basically wondering, will there be a common position on, for example, the sanctions that have been set for discussion? So I think it just remains to be seen in the next few weeks what will happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Albulescu. But do you have an answer to this question, or it was just rhetorical?
It wasn't necessarily rhetorical. My hunch is that, for example, if you look at the question of economic sanctions, it was very difficult, I think, for the European Union after the annexation of Crimea to reach a decision on economic sanctions. And plus, there's a lot of differences now in terms of the European politics. Britain is no longer in the European Union. That's one thing. They have a very strong position against Russia. Then there's Germany, newly elected. And then if you look at France, we don't know who's going to be the next leader. So there's a lot of complications in terms of European politics so that we can find a common position at this point. But I don't want to be very pessimistic.
Okay, thank you very much. You're not pessimistic at all. You were right in saying that France is now already trotting on the unpaved way towards a new presidentship, but at least there is something physically existent in discussion, and these are, and Sebastian knows this because we have laughed a lot about it. That's the German helmets.
Yes, that's true.
The German helmets. Thank you, Dr. Albulescu. Dr. Mustăța.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Ungureanu, and to everybody involved for organizing this discussion. It is indeed needed to bring to the public this informed comments, as there has been a lot of speculations which have not necessarily originated from experts, from people with expertise on the matter. Just a short comment on the present day situation, and then a question addressed to our honored speakers that are still with us. In my opinion, for a researcher like myself that studies the 1990s and Boris Yeltsin's presidency, I have to say that the present situation is not or should not be surprising, at least not entirely. And this is because the rhetoric on the Russian side, the Russian rhetoric on NATO and on Ukraine's significance is not new, and is definitely not restricted to Putin's administration. Something like this has been said also today by Mr. Perry, if I'm not mistaken. Guedes presented in the public space in this past few months started to be transmitted ever since the 1990s, and not at the end of the 1990s, but even in the first half. I can't say that I can notice a shocking evolution in the discourse in general on Russia's role in the world or NATO. For example, even Kozyrev, the liberal minister of foreign affairs, seen by many as a big hope in the 1990s, as a breath of fresh air in the first years of the Russian Federation, even he spoke of red lines. If I'm not wrong, from the top of my head, he published an article, I think, in Foreign Affairs, or a publication of this kind, an article in which he laid out the Russian perspective and their fears born out of the idea that NATO may expand, and he talked about these red lines, things that are being discussed nowadays as well. So to wrap up, the factor of surprise that has been so present in the media, but not only, has no place in my opinion. Anyway, going back to my question, I wanted to ask you, all of you, what is your take, and also to wrap up, why this escalation at this moment? Because there has been some discussion on the matter in the public space, and I dare to say that the answers have not been quite pertinent, and I think that we should also address this issue. Thank you very much.
So sorry, Dr. Mustața, to whom did you address?
To whomever would like to approach such matter at this time, because again, I've noticed this. Everybody is talking about what's happening, but little attention has been granted to why now.
Okay, and thank you for your comments. Who'd likes to jump in? For
Mihai, if you like.
Yes, please, Sebastian. Gladly.
After more than 2 hours of discussion, probably cheap try for laughs answer would be, why now? It's because of the Olympic Games. Huh? The probably more realistic answer that I would see is that we don't see struggles that are going on within the Kremlin that leads to certain developments, and this uncertainty leads to the bigger uncertainty that comes here, because it's still not clear, is Putin going to run again? I mean, at least on paper, he has now the possibility, but will that happen? Is which force inside the Kremlin is going to shape the further development of the Russian Federation after Putin? And I would see at least, different fractions from being more economically liberal to being proud nationalistic, and also the military branch, being at least only 3 of them that would play a role here. Ultimately, I do not want to be that pessimistic, and I'm very well aware of what I have mentioned would lead to a toppling of the current regime, and that doesn't necessarily mean that there is going to come out, that there is going to come something easier out of that situation. But I've heard a lot of historic comparisons in the last weeks, and I feel they're like a little bit of comparing apples to eggplants or whatever, because we should learn from history, but history, I don't think, is repeating itself. It has its own way that is going to happen, and we shouldn't be stuck in several schemes that we are thinking just because we know our history, and then some sort of self-fulfilling prophecy comes out of this. So I don't believe that there is a pattern that will follow, but I think that there is a certain start of an end game when it comes to the democratic development. And then that ultimately, of course, if that declines, it would lead to conflict, which goes then into a direction that Professor Diaconescu has mentioned, that a long period of peace, the longest in history of Europe, is about to end. But let's hope that we find another way out of this. And the question should not always be to ask, like, how can everybody save its face? And the second question then cannot be, how can the big countries save their face? Because the era of big and small countries, at least on the European continent, with the European Union being established, should have been over. And Orban is an example for this, isn't it?
Yeah, Sebastian, you are absolutely right. I enjoy my privileges as the administrator of the platform, and I saw the message Professor Diaconescu addressed you about personal interpretations, well, politically addressing personal interpretations of history, which is right. And Putin, yes, has its own reading of the past. But this is what happens to all of us. We all have our particular interpretations of the past. Nevertheless, we are not in his position, not in Putin's position, who's basically he has gone beyond the point of no return. What will happen with him as individual when he will not be in power anymore? I don't want to imagine. Usually when confounding itself with a statue that's been erected for eternity, the end comes in the form of a furnace, because there'll be some other people who know exactly what uses the metal of the statue could then have. And coming back to what you said, Sebastian, and indeed very important, is what the succession will be, and whether succession in Kremlin would be likely to end this time of incertitude. I wouldn't say conflict, but incertitude. If it is an acted incertitude or it is a real incertitude, I don't know. But one of the figures I've seen behind Putin in the past years, and even more now in the past weeks, was Shoigu, who looks very much modeled, or at least conceived in the mold Putin was conceived some good dozens of years ago. So, and Shoigu is younger, and maybe as fit as Putin himself, but in any case, younger. Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you for your attention and interest. Cannot be but very grateful to our younger friends, to my colleagues in Bucharest, and I quote again to Sebastian, to Dan Perry, to Andreas Umland, Misha Kemper from the Netherlands, and Armando Marques Guedes. Thank you so much to all of you. Have a nice evening, and I am absolutely convinced those who have followed us, which was quite a large number of people, have enjoyed this interaction, academic interaction, happening onto the most important subject at the order of the day. I wish you all have a peaceful time ahead of you. Keep yourselves safe, and we will see each other again. We'll see all of us actually again in approximately 3-4 weeks from now on for our next proposal of podcasting. Thank you very much to all of you. We should have a nice evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.